I'm Christy,
And I'm Kathy.
and this is The Psychic
And the Skeptic. Welcome back to The Psychic and the Skeptic. And on this episode, we are entering the last part, hopefully, part 5. Although, if you've enjoyed it, let us know. Part 5 of the Psychic Detectives series. We just had so many really cool psychics to talk about that it ended up being 5 parts.
and cool cases.
Right. Especially for you true crime fanatics. Today, we're going to talk about John Edward, James von Praagh, and Elizabeth Lerner. We'll go into some of the bigger cases that he might have worked on, but John Edward and James von Praagh are two more well-known, I would say,
Very.
out there because of the media coverage that they've had, the TV show John Edward had. I remember watching that one. That
Oh, I
was
do
a
too.
really cool one.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the first time I really had a peek into what psychics can do. And he had a lot of scrutiny because of all the doubters out there about psychics to begin with. But he would do a lot of large group readings.
Yeah.
And would pick up on somebody in the crowd. And the skeptics ran wild with that because if you put 100 people out there in an audience, eventually somebody's going to have a grandma that passed and they're going to
Right.
make the connection and think that they're talking about their loved one. So they stand up and he continues the reading and he'd talk about jewelry, which is a common thing people would bring that remembers a loved one in hopes that they reach out and want to communicate on this event.
Yeah, his show was called Crossing Over with
That's
John
right.
Edward. And there was controversy surrounding his show and his accuracy. Some people found it to be very valid, but other people were like, he puts information underneath the people's chairs. And I remember when that controversy came out. I don't think they
Yeah.
could ever prove that, though.
So somebody just assumed that's what they were doing?
Yeah. Like he would put information he had like paid actors in the audience, and they would have stuff taped to the bottom of their chair that they were supposed to look at. And yeah, I don't think they ever even found evidence of that. I think it was just speculation. I don't know. I don't really
Yes.
remember. I know it was back in the 90s,
The
early
naysayers.
2000s, something.
The skeptics who are not open like myself.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think a skeptic will always be a skeptic and find a way to explain, but without the proof that he was being deceitful,
Yeah.
then they really don't have a leg to stand on. So yeah. You would think that people would have come forward and admitted to it or something.
Yeah, and I think that's why they couldn't ever prove that claim is because no one did. He is well known, and the case that we're going to talk about is the 1974 Janice Hartman case. Do you remember hearing about this one?
Not particularly.
It was reopened back in the 90s just because, and I won't get into details to spoil it, but the guy who is responsible for this struck again in 1991.
Oh.
And both of these victims were his wives. Wife number 1, wife number 2.
Okay. Yes. And John Edward was involved, how so, on this?
He was actually contacted by the detective, and I'll bring that up a little bit more as we get into this, but he didn't seek this out. Law enforcement sought him out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you think his show had been on for a while and law enforcement saw what his gifts were like or saw what he was capable of doing and then reached out to him to see if he could help?
Oh, I'm sure that, and he did assist law enforcement on other cases, as some of our psychic detectives that we've previously spoken about, and maybe he was helpful and beneficial. And again, we know that no psychic is going to ever get credit for, quote, solving a crime, but if they could get some good clues and stuff in there, then absolutely, why not?
Sure. Yeah.
So he
narrow
was
down a search area or something like that, right?
Yes. And as we start to talk about this case, I'll go into those impressions that John got for law enforcement. Let's go ahead and start by giving a little background on exactly who Janice Hartman was. So she was born March 2nd of 1951 in Ohio. She was considered very smart, outgoing, very close with her family. And in 1970, at the age of 19, she ended up marrying John David Smith III. Now, despite their youth, neighbors and relatives described their marriage as troubled and gave reports of a lot of abuse and a very hostile marriage. Now, in 1974, after being married for 4 difficult years, Janice, she'd had enough. She decided, hey, I'm out of this marriage. Can't blame her, to be honest.
Yeah.
So she left John and returned back home to Ohio and began to finalize their divorce. Now, the divorce was finalized on November 14th of 1974, and a few days later, on November the 17th, she was last seen by friends and family. Her husband filed a missing persons report 2 days after her disappearance. He told the police that Janice had packed a suitcase and had left on her own, possibly for Florida. Now,
That's so suspicious because they're about to finalize the divorce. You wouldn't leave right before, especially
right?
if she's the one who wanted the divorce.
And Florida, of all places, her family's up north in Ohio.
Yeah.
So unless if she was taking a vacation to Florida, I'm sure she would have told family, hey, I'm going to be out for a
You're
bit.
not going to go right before your divorce is finalized again. You got stuff to do.
Yeah, you got to go to court. So yes. So her family and friends, they knew that something was wrong, though. They were alarmed. This definitely raised some red flags. And they reported, hey, this is completely unlike Janice. And Janice had always maintained regular contact with family. So this was not like her to say,
Right.
no contact, I'm just out. Now, soon after Janice had vanished, John's brother, Michael, noticed something chilling. And in their garage, John had been building a long wooden narrow box. Now, this was on their grandfather's property. And John claimed that it was for Janice's belongings. Okay, little red flag here too. Hey, your wife's disappeared and you've got a wooden box that you're building in a garage. Does that not?
These are all the signs.
Exactly.
I think we have sometimes when I'm listening to true crime podcasts and they're talking about obvious signs in hindsight that is to us, but 1970s is the time frame we're talking about, and this is why we now have red flags for these kind of things,
Right?
because we find out after the fact what they were up to.
Yeah, get this, it even gets better. So in 1979, John's grandfather opened the box in the garage.
Oh no.
Yes. And he found a decomposed body inside. The legs had been severed to make the body fit. Michael was there with them. And Michael believed that this body was his former sister-in-law, Janice. Now, rather than get a hold of the authorities, the family felt that they were bound by loyalty, and they were also scared.
That's
Yeah.
a bunch of bull.
They let John take the box out of the garage and take it away. Now, this is not the last of the
What?
box, because in 1980 it resurfaced in an abandoned rural Indiana field where a road crew discovered it. But without any identification, the remains were buried as a Jane Doe. They didn't know who she was. They were forgotten and unnamed for decades. So at this point, with no body, no evidence, no information, Janice's case went cold. Now, we're going to fast forward to 1991. John Smith has remarried, and this time he remarried to a lady named Betty Fran Gladden Smith. While recovering in a home from a broken hip, Fran mysteriously disappears without any explanation.
I think I know where she went.
You think? Wonder if he built a box for her, sadly.
Maybe I'm psychic. Just
I'll get a new label for you, and you can just wear it proudly on your head. Those I voted signs.
We'll have to change this podcast to the Psychic Squared.
Right? And now they're living in New Jersey at the time. And police in New Jersey reopened the investigation when they learned that John's first wife, Janice, had also vanished under suspicious circumstances.
Huh, so they're putting 2 and 2 together.
You think? Now, this pattern raised some red flags and it brought the spotlight back on John Smith. But still, where's the evidence? And that's what's allowed John Smith to get away. There's no evidence. And whatever he did with Janice's body,
Yeah.
no one knows until it was discovered. But still, it's so decomposed, you can't connect it to who she is.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is just lack of experience in law enforcement, but you have an unknown body found and you have a missing person. I wonder, unless they're just overwhelmed with so many cases. You did mention the body was dumped in a rural area.
Yeah, in
So,
Indiana.
how many missing people do they have and that fit the description of the body that was discovered? And then try to make those connections on who this missing person could be. You don't think that they just, I don't know, let's just throw it in a drawer, close it, and call it good.
And here's the thing, if Janice is from Ohio, her body ended up in Indiana. Were they even looking for Ohio missing people?
At this point, when people go missing, we're not law enforcement. So clearly
Right.
there's some procedure. Or maybe it's cases like these that have resulted in better communication across state lines. If you've exhausted all of your resources in one state, are you looking into the neighbor states, looking at the list of missing people? Now we have computers and descriptions that can go searching through databases. So that's probably why this was cold for so long, is the technology just wasn't there yet. And the communication might not have been as established as it is now.
Now, they started getting into some DNA evidence in the early 80s. DNA was in its infancy.
No,
So-
and they didn't even trust it then because it was new technology. So
Right.
even if the DNA could match something, it wasn't admissible in court because it still hadn't been tested enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, and this is where some of these psychic detectives, especially 30, 40, 50 years ago, where they come in handy helping out with some of these cold cases.
And maybe
So-
that's why we don't hear about it as much in the 2020s, because we have so much technology now.
Don't have to rely on psychics as much.
Because it's not solid evidence from a tangible viewpoint versus a psychological viewpoint.
Exactly. Let's fast forward a little bit now to the late 1990s. You've got FBI Special Agent Robert Bob Hillen, who was working the case. Now, despite decades of interviews, tips, and leads, the second wife, Fran, her whereabouts were still unknown, and Janice's remains were still never formally identified as being her. So in 1998, Detective Hillen was really struggling with this cold case, so he did something out of the ordinary and contacted psychic medium John Edward. John Edward, by this time, was famous from radio and television shows.
Yeah.
Yeah. And despite kind of having some of his own investigational opinions and options, he went ahead and went with Edward. And what John Edward reported initially were impressions, and we know how this goes for discussing past cases. These psychic detectives get impressions, they can use psychometry. There's just different ways that they make these connections. So now, according to this FBI Special Agent Hillen, John Edward did not claim to, quote, solve the case, but he described what he experienced as these persistent intuitive images that were tied to the victim and the environment surrounding her death. So we'll first focus on Janice and how Edward was able to help her. Now, one of the strongest impressions that Edward reported was that Janice Hartman never voluntarily left. He describes having a sense of interruption. A life stopped abruptly while still in motion. The emotional tone that he conveyed wasn't one of her trying to plan an escape or to just escape in general, but more of as though her life ended suddenly, and indoors, by the way. He also emphasized a male presence connected through marriage, so her abductor or murderer was not a stranger. He was related.
So I'm going to just interrupt right there.
Sure.
Because so far what he's getting He could have just taken a long shot here and just assumed she was dead. But again, I got to think about the time frame.
Mm-hmm.
This is now in the 90s, right? So it's
Right.
been a few decades. We have an idea how these things go now with these bad marriages and crime and missing wives. Anybody probably could have guessed her life was abruptly ended, wasn't a stranger.
It's her husband.
She's in the middle of a divorce. This is all stuff that I think anybody could guess and get correct about 90% of the time.
So you're saying if you were John Edwards, you'd be giving an accurate prediction because it would match the common sense out there.
He'd be wrong and nobody would really care because they weren't expecting much out of a psychic reading. But if he's right, woo, it's going to get everybody all excited about it. I will, though, give the benefit of the doubt. Of course, there's more details that you're going to get to, but the point of him saying that this happened indoors is something, now we're getting a little bit more specific.
That's
He could have
interesting.
kept it super general, so I don't know. If he's a schemer, he probably could have been saying indoors, I got to do something a little bit different. And we'll just 50-50 chance, indoors versus outdoors. Let's just say indoors, right? Maybe that's correct. And that's information maybe we'll never find out. We just know what happened to her. And where does the evidence lead us? Where does the evidence point to? So what else did he happen to?
Edward did say that this person who took her was someone that she trusted, someone who she had legal and emotional ties to. Now, investigators were already suspicious of John Smith at this point, and what John Edwards said basically reinforced their instinct to keep the spotlight firmly on the ex-husband rather than chasing theories that Janice had run away, etc. Now, another repeated impression that Edwards reportedly shared involved confinement. Now, he felt that it wasn't a burial in the ground, but rather a containment.
Okay, so now those are some specifics.
There you go. And we already know that her body was put in that wooden box.
Right.
But John Edward described a sensation of the body being placed inside something constructed or altered by human hands. And this was not described as a coffin or a grave, but more as like a box-like enclosure. And he felt a very strong emotional discomfort attached to the box. And he did not report the box outright, but referred to more like it was stored, it was kept, or it was hidden in plain sight. And this is what he told to Hillard. Now, years later, this impression would align disturbingly well with the wooden box built in the Smith family garage. Edward also conveyed his impressions about the family knowing without taking action.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Because I would say, here's the skeptic here. If you were already aware of a case, a cold case where the wife has gone missing, 90% of the time, the husband did it.
Right.
They even made a t-shirt that says the husband did it. So we all know that that's more likely if you want to increase the odds that the story John Edward is coming up with is going to turn out to be factual in this case. And even still, trying to hide a body. He didn't say a box specifically.
No, a
But he
container.
did say it was contained and hidden in plain sight, which again, if you're decades from this person going missing, most of us could probably guess that they're hidden in plain sight. That's why they've not been discovered. Because you don't think about these obvious places.
And the fact that the family had knowledge but didn't do anything about it, that is pretty
supports
specific.
The plain sight, too. Hidden in plain sight. Family would have to know, don't open that ice chest.
Or the freezer.
Or the wooden box in the garage.
And Edwards even said, hey, I got this sense of the family knowing something was wrong, yet they chose not to intervene out of fear, loyalty, or some sort of denial.
Yeah, and that's not the first time that has happened in one of these type of murders, too, where the family helps to keep it hidden. Obviously, it's not a true crime podcast, but just pointing out some more facts. Less likely, but facts that can be common and somebody could guess if they're trying to be psychic.
So the fact that Edwards had described that someone in John Smith's family knew something was going on or something wasn't right, this matched Hillard's gut feeling, and it really stuck with him because he knew that this was some sort of vital information.
So it's validation for the investigator.
Pretty much, yeah. And then Edward went on to say, hey, something with it being in rural or semi isolated type areas, places where objects could be left unnoticed for years, like fields, edges of properties, places that are not frequently traveled. Again, he didn't give things like the exact coordinates on a map, right? But the information that he did give later echoed the rural Indiana location where these unidentified remains had been discovered decades earlier.
So this is that retrofitting. You say it's an empty field, and later we find out where the body was. Oh, hey, yeah, it's an empty field. That's
Right.
retrofitting. If you say something common enough, you can connect it back to a claim on a psychic reading as being accurate.
If you think about the last case that we discussed on the last episode, a body had been placed in a rug inside of a couch.
Yes, that was super impressive.
Yes. So it's not like they're getting that information, but I do feel
Right.
like there is some information here that Edward gave that is
I'll give him the
vital.
benefit of the doubt. Keep going. Let's see what else he got.
Okay. Of course, Janice by this time had already been found. She just wasn't recognized. And her body had been recovered at some point, but her name had not been connected with this missing body. So, this impression did reinforce Hillard's decision to re examine the unidentified remains from this late 1970s, early 1980s case.
See, now he's starting to think, right?
Right. Now he's putting two and two
This is what I
together.
was saying. It's like, what about all those unidentified bodies?
Right. Now, Edward also tuned in to Janice's emotional state and said he felt like there was some sort of sense of betrayal. She wasn't confused, and it wasn't like a panic feeling. It was more of realization like, oh, crap, I'm being betrayed. My husband's killing me, sort of thing.
Okay, so this has me thinking. So he's tapping into her emotions before she dies. So this, as paranormal investigators, is similar to what we might see from a residual type energy, that energy that's imprinted right before somebody passes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. And it seems like some of these other psychic detectives try to do that, or that's the image they get is those moments right before death. Do you have any insight on that?
Actually, yes. I have had connections with spirits where I can get their emotional state before death and even afterwards. I think when you get them prior to their death, they're showing you what they went through. They're letting you experience the things that they've actually experienced.
And why do you think that would be how it's communicated? Because do you think that John Edward is picking up on a residual energy, or do you think that this is how the spirit is connecting or communicating with him?
Okay, so in this case, I do believe the spirit is showing him. This could very well be Janice saying, hey, this is what happened to me. And again, if you remember, when psychics get information, sometimes it's like a puzzle and you've got to fit those pieces together.
Right. Yeah. I guess I'm just curious as to why the message isn't just a, hey, my body's here. Why do you have to go through the whole chronological process leading up to the act?
That's a good question. I think some of that is because it's the way that the spirit relays that to you. So if they're still in a distressed state, you know how it is if you're panicky, right? Then you can't always think clearly or convey what you want to say. The same for spirits.
Do you think their spirit's just stuck in that emotional state and that's just what he's picking up on?
They could be, yes. They could be. And sometimes it could be a residual imprint. In this case, I believe it was more or less coming from the spirit. Now, I don't know that to be 100%, but the things that he's getting, it sounds to me like that energy is being left for him from the spirit.
Yeah, I suppose if spirit is able to communicate with us, the reason maybe it's just not that easy and to just say, oh, my body's 2 clicks from this mark and GPS coordinates are XYZ. If that were the case, then we wouldn't have any unsolved cases out there.
Here's the thing. Did they even know exactly where their body was taken after
Right.
death.
Mm-hmm.
Do they know all the details? Maybe they didn't. And that's why they can't give you
And
every bit of information that you need.
maybe the only thing that she's able to show him is, this is my husband. This is how I felt
Her
at the
viewpoint.
moment. And
Yeah, definitely. I remember when I also told you that sometimes you can see things about a spirit through their eyes, or you may see you're standing off as a third party watching. Depends on how they want to give you that information. This here sounds to me like Janice was conveying what she was feeling at the time of her death.
to help
Hey, I'm in a
give
box.
clues about
Yes.
what was going on, and maybe
Yes.
help lead him to the right spot.
And to identify it as being her. John's family knew, they kept it a secret,
Oh, yeah.
but he killed me, he put me in this box. you
Yeah,
know?
I'd be portraying that kind of emotion as well, to get that family. Don't forget them. They helped.
And a lot of it is frequency waves. How well is that psychic connected to that frequency wave of
Right.
that
Yeah.
deceased individual,
Yeah.
that soul? But Janice knew that she had been betrayed. She knew that her husband was the one that did it. Now, as you said earlier, none of these impressions were able to be used as evidence in court. It's just hearsay, right? How can you prove what someone's getting up in their head is legitimate? This is where that physical evidence comes in. But Hilliard had enough of this information from these impressions that he was making mental note of it, right? He was like, okay, I'm going to do detective work and I'm going to try to figure this out. It made him think, okay, there's more to this case than not. And this will give me a little motivation to get out there and really solve this, figure out really what happened. Now, the most significant breakthrough came when Michael Smith, now remember, this is the brother of John Smith, he finally came forward in 1999 and he confessed to Detective Hillen and other investigators what he had seen in 1979, which was,
So the guilt was killing him.
and he said, hey, I saw this box in the garage and I saw its contents. And with that tip, authorities then were able to track down the remains previously buried in Indiana. And in 2000, scientific testing confirmed that the body was Janice Hartman.
I think at this point, John Edwards' impressions were keeping investigators looking at the husband and not wasting time on other tips. So now Hilliard's looking at unidentified remains in surrounding states to see if there's a connection there. But clearly, a few years had gone by, and now we've got this confession, which you can see in hindsight, that's what really got the case going, because now they have a statement from a family member and a confession. The guilt had been eaten at him for so long, or maybe he believes in psychics and was aware that they were talking to John Edward and knew his time was numbered, and
They were going to catch him.
yeah.
But I don't know. If I saw something like that and saw a body,
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
My family,
I think most of us would do the right thing.
oh,
I
I
would hope.
would. I absolutely would.
I understand
ugh.
loyalty, but
But you got to know something's wrong with your relative when they're murdering their
spouses.
yes and putting them in a box and chopping off their legs to begin with. That's just
Yes,
disgusting.
and I would be concerned about a family member just for their mental health and the state that they're in, that they would do such a thing.
Exactly.
But still, second wife was murdered in 1991, so brother came by 8 years after that before he finally decided to say something. Here's a second woman that's gotten killed.
Maybe I should step up and say
Yeah, it
something.
took
You
him 8
think,
years
dude?
to decide that.
So with this evidence, though, John Smith was, with the DNA testing that it was Janice Hartman,
Right.
John Smith was finally arrested in California later in that year, and that was in 2000. Now, in 2001, he was finally convicted of murdering Janice Hartman, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Now, Smith was also indicted for the disappearance of his second wife, Fran Gladden Smith, and years later, the charge, however, would eventually be dropped due to problems with the evidence. Again, they're looking for that evidence, but he did report disposing of her body. Now, come on, if he is admitting to that, he killed her, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to back up just a little bit. by the time we reach 1991, now, John's past should have been catching up with him, right? But instead, history was about to repeat itself with his second wife. Now, after Janice Hartman vanished in 1974, John Smith eventually remarried, and his second wife was called Betty Fran Gladden. Now, she was described by friends as very kind, practical, and cautious. And by the early 1990s, Fran ended up in poor health. She was recovering from a broken hip, and this limited her mobility. Now, she did rely heavily on John during that period, and that would be something, too, that would later raise some serious questions. So in October of 1991, Fran disappeared from their home in New Jersey. Smith told the authorities that Fran had either left on her own or had possibly been taken away by family members. Just like in Janice's case, nothing about that explanation made sense. Fran left behind her belongings, her medication, her walker, and there was no evidence that she had any physical ability to travel unassisted. She's recovering from a broken hip.
Right.
Come
yeah.
on. Now, friends and family were alarmed, and her family was very unconvinced that what John was telling them was the truth.
Right. And one of his excuses was that family had taken her away, but they're concerned. So obviously,
Right.
that wasn't the case.
Right. So now, there are some parallel things that match Janice, right? Another wife was gone. This is another vague story told by John, and another trail that ends up going cold fast. This is what investigators believe happened. Although her body was never recovered, law enforcement believe that she was murdered, most likely by her husband, John Smith. And years later, during negotiations with federal investigators, Smith admitted that Fran was dead and claimed that he had disposed of her body. However, this admission came as part of a legal strategy, and prosecutors ultimately dropped the murder charges related to Fran due to a lack of recoverable physical evidence and concerns about securing a conviction. Still, investigators have consistently stated that they believe Fran was killed in 1991, making Janice Hartman and Fran Gladden Smith part of the same pattern.
It's interesting that you would drop murder charges when somebody says and admits they disposed of her body. So they want you to confess, but when they do, we'll just drop the murder charges.
Mm-hmm.
So it had to have been something related to some kind of plea deal, or maybe they were looking to try to get some kind of insanity plea or something.
Yeah, something, because again, they didn't have her body. They had no physical evidence.
And they
John
have to
was
connect
smart.
it somehow. You can't just say you hid the body and good luck finding the evidence to connect that. You can't just take somebody's word for it, which is why you just can't take the psychic's word for it.
Now, wait a second. If you're a good psychic, you can. Okay, so we're going to talk about the FBI agent, Bob Hillen. He consulted John Edwards, and it wasn't just about Janice. Now he's like, hey, John's second wife, Fran, has disappeared, and John Edward begins to do his psychic impressions, right? He got this strong impression that Fran did not survive long after her disappearance. He had this sense of an extended captivity, no ongoing movement. He described the emotional tone as heavy, resolved, suggesting that her death occurred quickly rather than spread out over a long period of time. He also shared that she had a physical vulnerability. And of course, we know she had a broken hip.
Yeah, these are pretty good specifics.
He emphasized that Fran was already injured or impaired at the time of her disappearance. And this just reinforced investigators' belief that she could not have left voluntarily on her own unassisted. This impression aligned closely with what police already knew about Fran's broken hip and her dependence on assistance. Now, Edward also reported conveying a strong sense of domestic containment.
There's that containment again.
Exactly. That whatever happened to Fran occurred inside the home or very close to it, not during travel or abduction by an outside party. This meant that it suggested there was some sort of like familiarity, not a surprise. So she knew her attacker, basically. One particularly unsettling impression involved water or removal beyond recovery. Edward did not describe a specific body of water or location, but conveyed a sense that Fran's remains were placed somewhere intentionally chosen to prevent discovery. So he's hiding her.
Isn't that what everybody does when they kill somebody? Again,
Yes, but no.
That's another one of those pieces that you could say about any case. Obviously, I'm going to give him some credit on the hip thing or the physical impairment. That's not common to most murder cases.
That was impressive, I would say. Now, this impression that Edward had about her remains, that kind of stayed with investigators because it did mirror Smith's later admission that Fran's body would never be found. So wherever he put her, he was going to make sure no one would ever.
Because his family found the first wife in the
Correct.
box. Yes, so
Correct.
he better hide better this time.
Now, Edward also stressed that the same man who was responsible for Janice's death was also responsible for Fran's.
Oh,
and he described that the connection was not a coincidence, but a repetition.
Yeah, but he already knew investigators were looking at this husband.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
But to him, he's, hey, it is the husband. How many times are you guys going to let this guy get married and then killed before you put him away for good? So even without a conviction for Fran's murder, her disappearance was critical in reopening Janice Hartman's case because it established a pattern.
Right.
Escalation and intent. There were 2 wives, 2 disappearances, and 2 stories of women who just supposedly left. Now, poor Fran, she never got the justice that Janice did, but her case did help ensure that Janice's death was solved.
Right.
So I do believe that Edward provided some good information. Maybe not all of it was helpful.
I think he didn't have any specifics on locating the body. And again, I don't think every psychic's going to be able to pick up on all the details in a case. But it sounds like a lot of it was very common for this type of murder, it being the husband trying to hide a body. The specifics to it might have been just enough information to help investigators stay on course with assuming the husband. So I think that's probably the extent of the helpfulness of it. It's really interesting that he was able to get some of these details, like the family on the first wife and the broken hip with the second wife. All of it, again, just is important information for the investigators to believe John Edward was truly picking up on the details of this case. So it kept them from wasting time looking at other potential suspects.
I agree.
So our next featured psychic is the infamous James van Praagh.
One of my favorites, yes.
Yes.
Giving you guys a little bit of background on James van Praagh. I had always heard that he was struck by lightning and that's how he got his gift. But that was not true. That was like, I guess, some rumor.
I don't think he'd be a ghost, probably.
No, because there are some people who do survive lightning strikes for
true.
sure.
Not a direct one, though, but I will digress.
Well, they still feel the shocks of it one way or another. But James van Praagh, he is an American spiritualist medium. He started to gain some attention in the 1990s, and that was mainly through television appearances, his best-selling books, and also his claim for being able to communicate with the dead. This is along the same time when John Edward was also...
And Sylvia Browne and all the talk shows. Yeah.
But James van Praagh, over the years, has actually appeared in true crime segments. He's got a big heart for people. He'll help these grieving families and give them some comfort. So he was born in Bayside, New York. And James was the youngest of 4 children. Now, according to him, his experiences with what he calls the spirit world began very early in life, even to the age of 8 years old. He was raised Roman Catholic. So while praying one day, he claims that there was this glowing open hand that appeared through his ceiling. And he said that he wasn't frightened by it. It was more peaceful and reassuring. When he was 14, he started to look for a deeper spiritual meaning, and he did that through the church. He describes hearing this spirit whisper to him one day when he was in seminary. It said, "God is much bigger than these four walls. You must leave and find God outside in the world." Interesting, huh?
Mm-hmm.
He also claims to have experienced spiritual phenomenon, including seeing lights and spirits since his childhood. He discovered his abilities in grade school. So this came about when his teacher's son had a broken leg, and he knew this before his teacher even did.
Oh.
And he told her, and I think that kind of made her scratch her head a little bit. But as a child, he was always fascinated with death and the afterlife. And a really important moment in his life came in 1985 when his mother passed away. Now, she, according to James, began visiting him and guiding him from the spiritual world. And this is something that he credits as the foundation to his development as a medium. Things started to shift dramatically for James because he began to explore spiritualism a bit more. He started to seek out other mediums and came across this one named Brian Hurst. And Brian told James that he would become a medium and that he would be able to help change the consciousness of the planet. And from that point forward, James began to give readings to people and actively start to study what he calls the development of his mediumship. Academically, he graduated from the San Francisco State University, majoring in broadcasting and communications because he wanted to become a screenwriter. So he wasn't really trying to do anything spirit-wise at the moment. He's still doing readings for people, still keeping the spiritual side going. But then he also starts to work in LA. He writes this book that's a huge hit. It's called Talking to Heaven, and I have read that. It's a really good book. He gets into paranormal, spiritual topics in his book. Then he goes on NBC's paranormal talk show called The Other Side, and that aired from 1994 to 1995. It just continues. In 1997, he went on Larry King Live, and then his book sales shot up from 6,000 copies to 600,000 copies in less than 3 months.
Yeah, he went on Larry King Live to promote his Talking to Heaven book.
And then other media appearances happened. He was on Oprah Winfrey Show, Dr. Phil, A&E's.
Seeing him on these, yeah.
Yeah, he was even on Unsolved Mysteries. In fact, the case that we're going to talk about today, Unsolved Mysteries, featured this case with him. So he's done a lot of work, and he also believes that really there's no such thing as an actual death. He believes, like what I believe in a sense, that even though your physical body dies, your soul continues on because it's energy, and energy cannot be destroyed in any way. And
so
I have
more
watched
of a transition than a death.
Yes, those are actually his exact words. I've heard him referred to that as the transition. So I have seen some of his work, and I'm going to be honest, I really do believe that James is legit. Some of the information that he gets, I work the same way as he does in a sense. And again, there's no 100% accuracy that any psychic can do. And this is where the skeptic can come in and say, oh, you were wrong on this and this. Yeah, you can get your wires crossed when you're doing readings, and this happens to the best of us.
Right.
So this next case that we're going to talk about, and I think the reason why we needed to explain him a little bit is because he is so well known, and just to give people an idea of how things came to fruition with him.
So he provided some insight for one of the more well-known cases of the early 2000s in Washington, D.C., the Chandra Levy disappearance. Chandra Levy was born April 14th, 1977. She was driven and ambitious, went to UC Berkeley and graduated, receiving a federal internship with the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. So she moved to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2001. And in May, she went out for a walk near Rock Creek Park. This is a massive wooded stretch that runs through the city. And she never returned. So she was missing for several days before her parents reported her as missing on May 6th, 2001.
I wonder why they waited so long to report her missing.
She's an adult. She could be out doing this or that. Maybe they only speak once a week. She was busy interning.
Yeah.
This report triggered an investigation that ended up spiraling into one of the most media-saturated cases of the early 2000s. Investigators immediately focused on Rock Creek Park because it was close to her home, it was familiar to her, and unfortunately has vast and difficult terrain to search through thoroughly. At the same time, the national media latched onto this story. I don't know if you remember hearing Chandra Levy all over the news at the time, but because she was also a young federal intern, and we know how that went for a certain government figure not too long before that, this led to a lot of speculation and rumors because of her personal connection to then Congressman Gary Condit. So, although he was never charged and later publicly cleared by investigators, the media speculation was relentless. They love a good tabloid, don't they?
Oh,
especially
they do.
During that time.
For sure.
Yep. And his political career collapsed under the weight of suspicion. And in hindsight, many journalists admitted that their coverage crossed ethical boundaries.
Uh-oh.
And I think, given the time, this is even after Jean Benet, so there wasn't a good case to talk about. And then, we've got this DC intern, so let's smear this and turn this into a political sideshow. So, unfortunately, that's what happened, and her poor name got dragged through the mud along with it. But because months turned into a year with no answers, the public was frustrated, and that's when the psychics began entering the conversation, including Sylvia Browne. But James Van Praagh also got involved in this case. So, what were some of the impressions that James got on this case?
Okay. Initially, James, he told investigators that he sensed several things about her disappearance. He did describe seeing her body hidden in or near a wooded park area, and he did feel like there was foul play involved, and especially like an attack or an assault, rather than this being an accident. Now, he connected emotionally as well, and just like we discussed with John Edward, he said that he felt feelings of fear and confusion and distress, indicating that she would have been very frightened at the time of her death. Now, he also mentioned that there was a male figure connected to some sort of authority or power, and there was secrecy and tension surrounding the case. But these impressions were a little bit vague, according to some investigators, and there were no names that he could give, no clear identifiers, no timelines. It left it open to criticism.
Skeptics, Some of what, as you're going through that, some of what I was thinking was how much was already in the media at this point. It had been a year, so he probably knew where she was last seen, which was a park. Some of these things makes me question, was this information he'd already had and it felt like he was getting that from spirit? Or she's young, an intern. It most likely ends up being foul play when you look statistically at her age and someone just disappears and there's no trace of her.
And politically, and that's another thing. He got this male figure, authority and power,
right. Yeah,
secrecy and tension.
About a guy involved with her.
He's probably picking up on something to do with the government position.
So because there's no real specifics there, I'm not crazy impressed, although he does have a pretty good track record with his readings and what he picks up on. So I'll give him that. But I would say in this particular case that anybody could have come up with those same impressions. But anyway, more than a year after her disappearance, on May 22nd, 2002, skeletal remains were discovered in Rock Creek Park. Dental records confirmed they were Chandra Levy's, and her death was officially ruled a homicide. though the exact cause could not be determined due to the conditions of the remains. So it had been there and lots of decomposition was present. This discovery led many supporters of psychic involvement to note that James van Praagh's mention of a park or wooded area broadly aligned with the location where Chandra was ultimately found. However, alignment stops there. Again, with the alignment, it was known that was where she was last seen. But years later, Ingmar Guandique, a park worker, was arrested and convicted in 2010, largely based on testimony from a jailhouse informant. He had no known ties to authority figures, which did not match van Praagh's psychic description. Even more critically, Guandique's conviction was overturned in 2016 after prosecutors were found to have withheld evidence and relied on an informant who had lied in multiple cases.
What evidence did they withhold, I wonder?
Guandique was released, charges were dismissed. Once again, the case remained unsolved. So when comparing James van Praagh's psychic impressions to documented evidence, the overlap remains broad but not specific. Ultimately, James van Praagh's input did not lead investigators to new evidence, identify a suspect, or clarify the timeline. As of today, no one has been convicted. It remains a cold case and one of Washington, D.C.'s most infamous cold cases, serving as a cautionary tale about media influence, investigative missteps, and the human desire for answers, whether through evidence or intuition. Chandra Levy was more than a mystery. She was a daughter, a scholar, and a young woman with her future ahead of her. Until her case is fully resolved, her story remains unfinished.
That's so sad that there's some of these cases that they just can't solve, or they can't find a body, or they don't have enough evidence.
Right, and why in some cases does the psychic get such specific detail and then in others nothing, especially with a cold case?
To answer that question, I'm just going to put it out there like this. Sometimes, especially if I'm doing a reading, I may get very vivid detail and just a lot of information. And then other times it may be more vague. And I think a lot of that has to do with how the psychic connects with those frequency waves.
Right.
How connected are they on the other side to what they're picking up on?
But with his track record and all of the different cases he's worked or readings he's done, you would think his gifts would be honed in better and you could tune into many different frequencies. You and I have discussed that theory a lot together about the analogy with the radio and tuning into the right station.
Yeah.
And you were watching you work with other psychic mediums, how some of you are spot on the same spirit and then others are picking up on different spirits in the same location.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think for someone to fairly judge is probably not the right word to put out there. If they're going to make a judgment on someone, then I think they really should inform themselves and educate themselves on how psychics work and watch and learn.
And speaking of learning, our final psychic detective for this series is Elizabeth Lerner.
Yeah, that wasn't cheesy.
Bad transition.
But it was good.
But I took the opportunity.
That is right. Jump right in on it. So we have a list of things to talk about.
A list. Yes, the John List murders is the case that Elizabeth got involved in.
And I'll give you a little bit of background on her. So Elizabeth actually emerged in the 1970s, early 1980s. And if you've listened to any of this podcast at all, you'll know this is a period when the psychic detectives were gaining some notoriety and visibility in the American culture. Now, Lerner described herself as a clairvoyant and an intuitive empath. So again, she has that ability to see and to feel things. She claimed to receive impressions through these mental images, through that clairvoyance, and then through emotional sensation. She also said that she would get more symbolic flashes rather than literal voices.
Okay.
So
John Edward was like that too.
Yeah. Now, according to Elizabeth, she says that she experiences these intuitive perceptions and has since childhood, and describes feeling strong emotional, quote, downloads, unquote, according to her, that connects her to people and places. Now, these experiences, she says, also intensified in adulthood, particularly during periods of meditation and quiet focus. She said she learned to interpret her impression as symbols rather than literal visions. Now, she didn't come from a formal law enforcement or academic background. Instead, Elizabeth was part of a broader spiritualistic and intuitive movement, and it blended a little bit of psychology and the metaphysics. And now she became involved in criminal cases after being approached by some private citizens and family members of missing persons who believed that her insights might actually help these traditional leads that had stalled. So again, like cold cases. Now, there is no, of course, independent documentation that she had in the way of some sort of formal training or certification, and most psychics won't have that. So a little bit of background on her, but she did help with this 1971 John List murder case.
Okay, so on November 9th, 1971, in the town of Westfield, New Jersey, John M.L. List murdered his entire family inside their 19-room Victorian mansion.
Wow.
Yes, his victims were Helen List, his wife, Alma List, his mother,
Oh,
and his 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. List shot each family member execution style one by one. He then carefully arranged their bodies, turned off the lights, and vanished. It wasn't until nearly a month later, on December 7th, that police discovered this. They were alerted by neighbors who noticed the lights had been left on and mail was piling up.
and by the way, I watched this on Unsolved Mysteries, and John carried all of his family's bodies into the living room and covered them up. And usually that's a sign of some remorse when someone covers up the face of someone. But he couldn't get his mother. She was upstairs and she was too heavy for him to bring down. But he laid them all in there. And then right before he left, he cranked down the air conditioner as low as it would go. And that was to stop the decomposition of the body.
Yeah, so he wanted to cool things off there.
Yeah, it gave him a month's head start.
This is all like premeditated when you have all this
Oh, yeah.
forethought to
He
try
knew what
to
he was doing.
hide evidence.
Yeah.
Investigators found multiple handwritten confession letters, a meticulous explanation of the murders, and a chilling motive. John List believed he was saving his family's souls. He had lost his job, was deeply in debt, and feared public humiliation. He was a devout Lutheran and convinced himself that killing his family would spare them from moral corruption and financial disgrace. After the murders, he disappeared successfully for 18 years.
Wow.
So what made him decide to carry on his own life?
Yeah, exactly.
And-
If his
and
family was at risk, what made him holier than thou
I don't know. You can't rationalize the irrational.
and into the mind of a killer?
Yeah.
Unless you're really good and then you might be part serial
That's-
killer yourself.
That's a whole other podcast. So, despite an early FBI investigation, List evaded capture by cutting ties with everyone he knew, changed his name to Robert Clark. He remarried and lived quietly in Colorado. And later, he lived in Virginia, and by late 1970s and early 1980s, the case had gone cold.
This is where Elizabeth jumps in and brings her psychic information into the case. Now, by her own accounts, she said that she felt that John List was alive, not dead, that he had changed his name, that he was living a quiet religious life. He had remarried. He was also residing in some sort of rural or suburban area, possibly near mountains or colder climates, and that he worked in a low-profile technical or accounting job. Emotionally, she connected and said she felt that there was an extreme emotional repression with him, that he was a man who justified his actions through rigid morality, and that he was someone who felt no remorse but believed he had done the right thing. So that's what made me think, okay, strange that he would cover up their faces when he left them there for dead.
Because that shows some remorse.
It does, yes, but yet he had none, according to her. Now, of course, law enforcement takes Elizabeth's tips, but they're not going to officially give her any credit. Now,
What we know for a fact is that in 1989, the case was finally cracked open, not through psychic means. An artist created a facial reconstruction that was then broadcast on America's Most Wanted.
I saw that. He did a really good job, by the way.
And a former neighbor also recognized this image. So John List, who is now, remember he changed his name, known as Robert Clark, was arrested in Richmond, Virginia, extradited to New Jersey, and put on trial.
Something interesting about that bust, that recreated bust, is they actually took a picture of John List's dad and then him when he's younger, and they looked at the jowl lines and extended that out. And something else that I learned when I watched that was this facial reconstructionist predicted that the way that John's personality struck him, he said, I like to get into the head of these people that I am creating the faces for. He said, I feel like he would have the same type of glasses on today as he did when he murdered his family.
This is almost 20 years later now.
So he put the same style of glasses on, extended the jawline, added some wrinkles, and sure enough, that's how the neighbor recognized him. Isn't that amazing?
Good guess, yeah. I guess looking how people have evolved over time.
That's how they do those kids that disappear, how they can do the age progression to see really what they would look like in the future. I think all that technology is amazing.
But in looking at what the styles are and how styles have changed, and that's just interesting. In 1990, he was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Many of the details Lerner claimed, the name change, remarriage, and religious lifestyle did not turn out to be true, but critics point out these traits could also be inferred logically from List's personality, letters, and known behavior. There is no official record showing that Lerner's information directly led to John's capture, but she did have some facts correct. Again, same skeptic viewpoint that we can just say over and over again here.
I think she did pretty good on the things that she gave, to be honest. She got quite a few things. So again, it goes back to how that information is conveyed.
And time again with all of these cases, wrapping up this whole series, the skeptics are going to say lots of the information is broad and generalized, and so were a lot of the law enforcement officers involved or other investigators. It was broad, it wasn't really helpful, or after the fact, we could easily connect these to the facts of the case, but many times in many of these missing person cases, the result is very similar when you're talking about where people hide bodies or the feelings and the emotions of the victim at the time of their death. It all statistically is very similar. And so that's the viewpoint the skeptic's going to take. But I, as the open skeptic, to give the benefit of the doubt in based on my own observations and what I've seen, again, with your gifts and with other psychics that I've met working in the paranormal field.
When I worked for Oklahoma County Sheriff's Department for those 6.5 years, I really was interested in working homicide as far as going in and just seeing psychically what I would pick up and get. And I have had people who have brought me pictures of their loved ones or pictures of someone who is missing and there's no information. And I've done the same thing as what these psychics here that we've talked about have done. You get those images, you get that information, and all you can do is convey it.
Yeah, and hope that it helps connect the dots and bring closure in a case.
Yes,
I would feel like that would be invigorating to be able to offer assistance like that just for the benefit of the good.
So in an upcoming episode, we're going to be talking about psychic readings. And you're going to get to see each of those readings are the same but different. And I think with people, if they could take a look like this objectively and just learn different information comes different ways.
Right.
Who are you getting that information from? How strong is your connection? All that makes a difference.
And this is how my thoughts as a skeptic have evolved to become more openly skeptical in what we do with paranormal investigation and how I'm the historical researcher to help validate those impressions that you get from spirit. And then over the years, observing you with other psychics and pairing and seeing how your messages evolve even on a case in live time. It's interesting. So I'm not going to say that James was completely off or just guessing in this case. It sounds with what you're saying that perhaps he could only really tune in vaguely with this particular one, or maybe there's something to the spirit itself and how their capabilities from the other side in communicating
Correct.
to the earthbound.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like a ceiling fan. You got spirit on the high level, you got us on the low level. And in order to get that information, spirit lowers that vibration. We raise our vibration and you meet in the middle.
Yeah.
And then depending upon how that connection is, depends upon what information you're able to pick up on and get. So one of the biggest things I would say for any psychic out there who was trying to get information in from spirit is trust your instinct, trust your gut. If you know how to connect, then it's all in how you make that connection. It's all in how you receive and understand that information that's coming to you.
So that concludes this 5-part series on psychic detectives.
I had fun.
Yes, I hope you have enjoyed this. I know it was really long, but it gave a lot of variety in all the different cases. Hopefully it kept you interested with the true crime component of all of this and the connection with psychic.
If you liked it, let us know.
And we hope you continue listening. If you are new to this podcast, we highly recommend going back and looking at some of our other episodes wherever your interests may find you. Yeah, so all things paranormal when it comes to the psychic and the skeptical viewpoints. You can share your own parastories, topic suggestions, and comments to psychicandskeptic, all spelled out, at gmail.com. So you can find us wherever you enjoy your podcasts, and thank you for listening.
Because the paranormal is the normal.
Not yet understood.